Hi, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Sharif Moore of the Drug Free America Foundation, and this is the Pathways to Prevention podcast, where we discuss some of the most innovative and inspiring work being done around the world in substance use prevention, treatment, and recovery. Joining us today is Theodore Caputi. Theo is a Ph.D. student in economics at MIT, and he's also the author of the Behavioral Health Matters blog for Psychology Today. His primary research interest is in behavioral public health, and much of his work has focused on research as marketing in the marijuana industry. So, welcome, Theo. You have a really interesting background. I read on your bio. How did you first become interested in substance use prevention?
Well, first, thanks for having me. This is my first time doing a podcast interview, so that's very exciting. I became interested in substance use many years ago because I feel that it's a very compelling social issue to study and to work towards a resolution. I think part of that is because of just the scope. Many people don't realize the size of substance use issues in terms of amount of people affected, amount of people who suffer from dependency, the amount of people who overdose and die per year is extraordinary. I think a secondary component to me was the justice component of substance use disorders. The vast majority of people who have substance use disorders began using when they were children. And as a society, we wouldn't, we don't have strict criminal penalties, for example, for people who are children, because we understand that they are in the development phases. And unfortunately, substance use can create something that lasts with people long beyond their childhood years. So something that to somebody might be a childhood indiscretion becomes a lifelong problem. And I think that the last reason why I became interested in substance use prevention and substance use in general is because I feel strongly that there is a lot that we can do to resolve the problem, and that the best solutions that we know haven't been implemented well, and the best solutions that we don't know haven't been discovered yet. There hasn't been a lot of attention devoted to this issue, for decades. Some of that started to change with the opioid epidemic, but still, given the size of this problem, I feel as though there are steps that could be taken that could really improve people's lives.
Yes, and I think the prevailing belief is that prevention simply doesn't work. I saw in your bio that as an undergrad at the Wharton School of Business, you did a lot of research on school prevention programs and applying business practices or solutions in order to evaluate the effectiveness of substance use prevention programs, which is pretty innovative. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, substance use prevention was kind of how I started out in the field, all the way back to when I was an undergrad. And I think that part of the motivation is exactly what you said. There's a widespread notion that prevention just simply can't work, that kids are doomed to use substances. There's nothing that we can do to stop them. There's nothing that we can do to prevent this scourge. It's just going to happen, and we just have to live with it, and we'll work with it on the addiction end, on the treatment end. And that's not true. There are prevention programs that are effective and cost effective in terms of, we save a lot of money from money that we don't spend in other programs over the course of that individual's life, because those programs are effective. However, I also saw that the prevention world was one of those areas of substance use that could benefit from, major research-based improvements. And I was in business school at the time, and for undergrad, and I realized that a lot of the metrics and ways of evaluating programs or substance use evaluating businesses and the things that businesses do could be applied to to substance use prevention programs to potentially improve how they're performing. The unfortunate thing is that so much money is invested into substance use prevention programs that are not effective for a variety of reasons. And we need to take a more critical look into what we're doing, because once we do that and we improve the quality of programming that we're offering, we will be able to show prevention, that we'll be able to influence popular opinion that prevention does work, because it does work. We have the evidence that it does. It's just a matter of the implementation.
Yeah. Now, did you find that the prevention community was receptive to your ideas about applying business methods to evaluating prevention programs, or did you meet some resistance with that?
I think that the prevention community is, I'm going to answer that question in two parts. The first part is that the prevention community, in terms of researchers and in terms of people who speak often with policymakers, are very receptive to the idea of improving prevention programming, because the evidence is there that prevention works, and that if we could implement this correctly, we could save a lot of money and save a lot of people's lives. So anything to enhance the quality of prevention actually offered to students, not the programming available, but the quality of prevention offered to young people, is usually met with good reception from those folks. They recognize the deficiencies in quality and are, hoping to make changes that will improve it. The approaching it from a business angle is just one perspective, one potentially newer perspective to the problem. But I mean, if we could just move so close as to, really nailing down what the relevant metrics for success are, which programs offer that success, what the treatment effects are, what the how those differ by groups that, by the audience that they're given to, that would be a huge improvement. So the second part of my answer is the folks that I honestly don't necessarily interact with too often as a researcher, but I'll say, and work in the world's best intentions, but potentially have some kind of have some feelings that inhibit that quality improvement. So substance use prevention programming can be a little counterintuitive. If you were to talk to an adult, a well-reasoned adult, the kind of adult who's implementing the program, a great way to scare or to prevent somebody from doing something is tell them about all the dangers. They're adults, they can reason through it. Most of them are not, most of the people leading these programs are not the world's biggest risk takers. Their minds are not, working in that way. And so you see a lot of prevention programs that use lots of scare tactics and things that, that there's not a lot of evidence for in the ways that they're implementing them. The old school DARE program is the classic example where people were using a lot of scare tactics. They weren't evaluating the program, but they were using scare tactics. And adults thought, this is great. If I saw these disturbing images, I definitely wouldn't go out and use drugs. That's just not the way that the teenagers that we're trying to reach work. We need to build social emotional learning skills that help them turn down substance use offers and work in this kind of counterintuitive way. So from that perspective, it is challenging, because there's this challenge because people people on the ground very often think that they're doing exactly the right thing because it's this kind of stuff that would work for them. And it might work for some students, but it's not the most effective way that we do things. And, those people might be a little bit more hesitant. But again, those are people who are the very on the ground workers who generally don't, interact with researchers like me too often.
Right. Well, I just think that's, really neat that you were involved in that kind of research as a Wharton student, because Wharton School of Business, I don't think is necessarily known for producing, socially conscious graduates. So maybe you're kind of changing that trend by the work that you've done there. And speaking of research quality, that's a good segue into some of the other work that you've been doing on marijuana and marketing. That is the marketing tactics used by the marijuana industry and how it's just really, really shocking how they are able to take this poor quality research and either make these vague claims or just frame it in a way to make it seem like the claim is legitimate and the research is solid and strong. And it's just, how do they get away with that in the United States of America, where things like this are supposed to be regulated?
Well, unfortunately, they're not regulated as well as they should be in the United States. These marketing claims has become kind of a core focus of my research over the past few years. And every time I, dive back into this, I'm always surprised with what gets through the cracks and goes basically unnoticed, not just in the United States, but also particularly Canada, where a lot of the major marijuana and medical marijuana companies are located. I think that how they get to this point is, owes a little bit to the history of marijuana regulation and the specifics of the legislation surrounding marijuana. So obviously, marijuana is federally illegal, but some states have legalized its use for either medical or recreational purposes. That creates this very strange structure where you could be doing something and a federal police officer would say it's illegal, but a state police officer wouldn't do anything about it. That's a very strange legal structure, and it leads to a very strange regulatory structure where the people who would typically be in charge of regulating this industry, which would be the FDA, who are technically in name responsible for regulating this industry and have taken steps towards doing more of it, find themselves between a rock and a hard place because they can't. They want to regulate it because they understand, the public health consequences of this, but they're also tasked with regulating a drug, regulating marketing of an illegal drug, which doesn't work very well. And how this all pans out is that the FDA and federal regulatory authorities don't regulate it as fiercely or as efficiently or effectively as they do for, say, tobacco and alcohol, which have their own problems. I'll leave that to later. And they leave it to the states. And the states simply don't have the regulatory capacity to monitor these kinds of messages. States don't have an FDA. States don't have the kind of, major teams that are required to monitor these issues over time, and legal teams to investigate when people are disobeying regulations about the statewide marijuana marketplaces. Ultimately, you end up with basically no regulation and what people sometimes call a wild west of which is increasingly east of marijuana regulation, and a lot of stuff goes that you wouldn't think would be possible.
It almost begs the question, like, what would be the lesser of the two evils? Because if we legalize it at the federal level, I mean, that's just going to open the floodgates, and we're going to have yet another addictive drug available to people when we're already in the midst of our worst substance abuse epidemic in history. But yet at the same time, the illegality at the federal level creates this schism that allows, for this deceptive marketing, which is quite effective in influencing people into making them believe these claims and thinking that it's safe and actually something that might be good for their health.
Yes, it's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer. I mean, I think that the steps that the FDA has recently made towards playing a larger regulatory role in regulating these state marketplaces is a step in the right direction. I think that it's the FDA is placed in a hard position legally, but if we could explicate the roles that people have, or that different agencies have, and what is allowed and what's not, then we might have a better shot of regulating these marketing messages effectively. I don't think that we necessarily have to legalize on the federal level in order to have federal regulation. I think it's possible that we explain, formally that this is a federally legal drug. However, we know that there are sales of it in states. The federal government is not pursuing, action in terms of not pursuing criminal action or whatever it may be towards individuals in those states. And so the FDA is going to start regulating this more as, more similarly to other recreational products. And from the medical perspective, the medical marijuana, as you alluded to, where people believe that this is a substance that's beneficial for their health based upon largely weak research, the FDA has a responsibility to interfere with messages about drugs, that are marketed at the FDA and the FTC have this authority and responsibility to interfere with drugs that are marketed as health products to protect health consumers or patients. And I think that should outweigh any other regulatory, hurdles. That responsibility is extremely important. And from that angle, they should probably, start treating marijuana as a, medical marijuana as a pharmaceutical drug and imposing the same pharmaceutical regulations that they do for
any other drug.
Any drug, right?
Yeah, I think people would be really surprised to know that the evidence base for a lot of the conditions that marijuana is recommended for is weak or non-existent. For example, PTSD. In most states with medical marijuana laws, PTSD is a qualifying condition, yet most of the research indicates that marijuana use actually exacerbates or worsens symptoms of PTSD.
Yes, I fully agree that I believe that the people have been misled by this tactic that I call research as marketing. And the idea of research as marketing is that I apply it mostly to medical marijuana companies, as you'll see. But the idea is that a medical marijuana company will either sponsor or publicize some weak research. And when I say weak research, I want to qualify that a bit. I want to say that it's not as though this research is pointless. I'm not talking about just bad research. This is the kind of research that may appear in a peer-reviewed journal and may build the foundations for future investigation. But it's not the kind of research, it's not the kind of robust, rigorous, causal research that, for instance, the FDA requires for pharmaceutical products. And so it doesn't tell us conclusively what these drugs do. They'll publicize or sponsor this weak research in order to convey to people that there's a research basis behind the health benefits of their product, whether that's marijuana generally or their specific product. And this is a very powerful tool that the marijuana industry has found, because the vast majority of individuals, as they should, don't know the difference, aren't discerning consumers of research products. They don't, you see that it's published in a peer-reviewed journal. If you are not a medical researcher, you probably have very little idea of the differences in quality or the differences in robustness of research that's published in peer-reviewed journals. And that's fine. You need foundational research that builds up to more causal, robust research. But they've leveraged this misunderstanding about the research world into a marketing tactic, because they realize that people don't know the difference. The weak research is cheaper, it's faster, it's easier to find results that are to our liking. Let's just invest tons of money, not even tons of money, but enough money and time into that to convince people that this is a research-based product. And then it looks to 90+% of the population just like any very well-researched study, like a vaccine or like an SSRI or any Humira, any prescription drug that has FDA approval.
So it can erode the credibility of biomedical research in general, because yes, as you said, the average consumer, perhaps they don't understand the importance of having a very large sample size. So like you said, the study design can be rock solid, but if your if your N is only 10, then those results aren't going to be generalizable, but it can be framed in such a way as, the average consumer sees it and they think that, oh, wow, this is solid. And this is a true claim that they're making.
One thing that I recently pointed out that I hope might ameliorate this issue is the parallels between cannabis research and COVID research. So, like I said, the vast majority of people don't know, and they don't need to know very much about medical research, because it doesn't make sense to invest, to have every single person be an expert in medical research. You need people to do everything else that there is to do in the world. However, when COVID came around, it became the number one issue on everyone's mind, basically every day for a year now. So a lot of people became more interested in medical research as a consequence. And some of the early things that people soon discovered just after the pandemic started was the differences in types of research that are available. And this came out with in particular with hydroxychloroquine. So if you might remember, President Trump or Elon Musk first, and then President Trump discussed the possibility of using hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for COVID in the very early stages. And they used, their references were these observational studies that seemed to show that maybe people who are using hydroxychloroquine have fewer symptoms or are better off in some way. And those observational studies made the rounds, and everyone, lots of people were convinced that this was the key to solving the pandemic. Soon thereafter, however, they conducted many randomized control trials, several small RCTs and one large RCT, and they all found that hydroxychloroquine did not improve people's lot with COVID-19. And people from that experience, I believe, learned about the importance of randomized control trials versus observational research in understanding, whether this drug works or not. And I think that has a potential, to carry over to the cannabis world, because a lot of the weak research that's done is observational research. They have surveys of people who use cannabis, and they ask them, does this make your X, Y, or Z symptoms go down? And they'll report that 95% of people reported better, symptom A, and that will be the study. And that's a study that will be published in a peer-reviewed journal, and could be foundational, to further research. But it's not a causal study. It's not what we need. What we need, just like with hydroxychloroquine, are those large-scale RCTs to confirm that these drugs are actually doing what they do. And lots of times, observational studies and preclinical studies and even early-stage clinical trials don't pan out at those large-scale RCTs. There's lots of promising stuff that just doesn't work in the real world, and we need to, take. I think that that's a real opportunity, because it turned public opinion to this specific issue.
And one of a prime example of a foundational study or hypothesis generating study, are these ecological studies that I'm sure the marijuana industry has been capitalizing on, and which really kind of boggled my mind. Experienced researchers, when they were getting these findings that medical marijuana laws were associated with a reduction in opioid overdoses, and all of a sudden they're touting medical marijuana as a possible cure for the opioid epidemic. And you commented on that in one of your papers and highlighted some findings from some of these studies, such as a 10 to 20% reduction in Medicaid and Medicare prescriptions in states that implemented medical marijuana laws, as well as a reduction in obesity. I mean, that just screams ecological fallacy to me.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I think that the ecological fallacy. So for those who might not know, the ecological fallacy is the idea that the same correlation you observe on the individual or on the group level might be different on the individual level. There was a study that was done. I'll probably misquote this, so just take this as an example rather than a definitive result. But it was a study that was done, I think, in France, and it found that regions that had higher smokers had fewer cases of lung cancer. That doesn't tell us very much. As we know, smoking does cause lung cancer, and all the individual level data tells us that pretty cleanly. The ecological studies, however, it's just a statistical, issue that ecological studies can't tell us anything about individual level correlation. And even there, we can't say anything about causation, but it can't even tell us about the individual level correlation. And this is amplified with things like medical marijuana, which are extremely, extremely rare. The percentage of people who use medical marijuana is extremely low compared to the effect sizes that these studies have found. And this harkens, it would just simply be impossible for a drug that's only used by this percentage and only therefore affects a very small percentage of people to have this large an effect size on the population. There's clearly confounding issues that come along. This harkens back to issues with research quality and the role of the industry in medical marijuana research, which I think is something that's very important. You're right that experienced researchers do this kind of research, and in reality, there is a lot of incentive for them to do it. Funding is flowing because this is the kind of research that medical marijuana companies want to sponsor. And these are high impact studies when measured in terms of things that researchers care about. They're high impact in terms of, if you publish a study like the ecological study that found that medical marijuana like legalization was associated with a decrease in opioids. That is going to get a lot of, CNN's, it'll be on CNN's front page, it'll be in the New York Times. It'll bolster the careers of every academic working on it. And there's just not a huge mechanism for, even though there were researchers who wrote a response letter, there's not a great mechanism for, clarifying how strong a piece of evidence is. This is a very weak piece of evidence. Could it be foundational for further research? Yeah, I mean, that's hypothesis generating. The next step is to investigate the hypothesis further. But they didn't, we don't see that. Instead, we just see this is a very cheap study, very easy to do, doesn't take a lot of time. You can publish it easily and you get your name in all the major headlines and you bolster your career, and the marijuana companies are very happy with your with your research output. And that creates a lot of, there's not a lot of incentives for clarifying what the high quality research is versus low quality research in the field, or advanced stage versus early stage, I'll say.
And in the meantime, companies like MedMen are capitalizing on this and encouraging consumers and youth to integrate marijuana into almost every aspect of their lives.
Yes. I think one thing that really interests me about marijuana is the interplay between the industry, the interplay between the industry, researchers, and consumers. And for that, on that note, also the media surrounding, marijuana and all of its properties. The one thing you can trust this industry to do is to try to maximize their profits. These companies like to portray themselves as avenues of science, as working towards the benefit of people who are very, very ill. That's how they like to frame themselves, and that's a good public relations strategy towards maximizing their profit. But the truth is, because they face basically no regulation in terms of what they can say and how they say it, these companies like MedMen in particular, and lots of other companies, really try to convey or use these weak studies to convey health benefits to adults and to kids, or I'll say more so to adults, and then those messages trickle down to kids. And, in the recreational sphere of things, they act very similarly to how we saw tobacco industries acting. If you go back 50 years, this is kind of they're just picking up the same tricks and trying it again. Companies that now the science of marijuana and its health effects is very complex, and there's a lot to be said, and we don't have all the answers. I can't sit here and tell you that marijuana is a bad drug and nothing good will ever come from it. Maybe in 50 years we find out that this was a lot to do about nothing, but we can trust that these industries are going to push for the same profit maximizing strategy regardless. And they're not,
even if it's at the expense of the public health, and even if they know that it's at the expense of public health.
Right. Yeah. Industries are industries. And without regulation, they just try to maximize profits. That's just what they do. And regardless of how nice a face they put on their company.
Now, as an economist, what do you see as some of the hidden costs of legalization that many people don't think about?
So I'll abstract away from marijuana for a second first, which is because we don't have all the answers on marijuana, and I'll talk about that in a second. But let me abstract away and talk to an industry that's to the two most similar industries, which are alcohol and tobacco. Alcohol and tobacco are often heralded as these tax revenue generating powerhouses, where this is tax dollars. This is how the states and how the federal government makes money by taxing these products, and isn't this great for everybody? Because the benefits are extremely high, and the cost. I mean, even if you believe, and you should, that tobacco is very dangerous. You could say, okay, well, I'm benefiting from. I don't smoke, so I'm just benefiting from the other person's tax revenue. So let them be. The problem with that is that the costs, even the costs, not just the personal costs, the costs that are absorbed by the smoker, the cost to society in terms of social programs, healthcare spending that leads over into higher insurance premiums, or it goes into Medicaid or Medicare. Those costs are astronomical compared to the revenue that we receive. And so it's a very short-sighted feeling that people have that this is good because it brings in tax revenue. This is the same as me offering you, $5, but then I'm telling you that, tomorrow you're going to owe me $100. Would you take that deal? Well, if you're only looking at the next 10 minutes, maybe. But if you're looking at the next day, which isn't very long, the costs far outweigh the benefits. So let me tie this back to marijuana. Marijuana is a much so the harms of tobacco are very well understood, and the tobacco industry has been around for a very long time. And there's been countless studies done about all the bad things that tobacco does. So we can estimate with a fairly good degree of precision what the costs of tobacco use are, and what the costs of every individual pack sold is. Marijuana is a much newer field, especially in marijuana is not newer, but it's a much newer field of research. It's a much less developed field of research. We simply don't have the precise estimates in terms of what the consequences and, to be fair, potential benefits of these products are. There are potential benefits. There are some FDA-approved drugs that use components of marijuana, but there's the idea that that this is strictly costless. Well, cannot be disproven, given the current evidence for marijuana. It seems foolish, because every drug comes with side effects. Unless this is literally manna from heaven, there's going to be some side effects, some trade-offs with this drug. So just looking at revenue is not the answer. Again, I'll say, 50 years from now, maybe we find out that this was manna from heaven. However, look at the benefits versus just the risks as opposed to the costs. The costs of tobacco, the costs of alcohol are astronomical. They're insane on every level. And that's the downside risk that we should be comparing a new drug like marijuana to. And the upside the upside potential is very small. There are lots of ways that we can improve the major costs about marijuana without legalizing the drug and making it available. And public health and medicine are successful fields because we act in a deliberate, conservative way. We don't jump into the deep end. We make sure that something works, and we take small, incremental steps. We're not doing that with marijuana, and we're taking the big gamble. And in that regard, I think that people need to be aware that the full precise estimates of the cost are not even going to be available for some time, and that this is a huge risk with very little potential reward. If we want to move in that direction, we should move very slowly and carefully and deliberately, and make sure that we're testing all of our assumptions and using highly robust research. That's what we should be doing. And those are the costs. The costs, I can't say with great certainty what they are, but there's certainly a high amount of risk that we're just taking in, and we're not really considering what that risk means.
And we don't yet fully know either, because I think a lot of what we do know about marijuana is based on less potent forms of the drug. See, now we have all of these high potency products. THC levels are at an all-time high in the dominant strains, and that's a new phenomenon. So really, this is like a large-scale natural experiment that's being conducted, on the populations of these states where recreational is being legalized.
I would hesitate to say that it's a large-scale natural experiment, because as a researcher, the words large-scale experiment really get me excited, and that's something that I usually look forward to. But I think that you're exactly right that there's lots of variables that are occurring. And a good contrast, I always think, is the pharmaceutical process, the pharmaceutical drug approval process, where at the very, there's lots of preclinical and early clinical research, and then there's the two large-scale RCTs. And these are well-controlled, randomized trials that are conducted on a large sample, but small proportion of the population. Thousands of individuals, sure, but that's small compared to 330 million Americans. That's the kind of robust research that might not be perfectly analogous to be feasible with something like a recreational drug like marijuana, but that's the kind of research that yields the causal evidence that we need to really figure out what this is. And instead, we're just diving into the deep end and taking on a very large risk. And the things that we do know are weak in general, and the pace of change in the industry has made it also really tough to figure out what exactly is going on. In a randomized control trial, you start with a protocol and you know exactly what's going to happen. The COVID vaccine randomized control trial, they gave every single person the same vaccine, and then they saw. Okay, I'm not saying that is perfectly replicable in this setting, but at the same time, we have to adjust for just a myriad of forces that are changing in the same time frame that this experiment's occurring. And that also decreases the quality of the research that's coming out and leads to less precision as to what we even know this drug could possibly do.
I wonder if the Canadians are tracking this and collecting data on potential marijuana-related health outcomes in any kind of systematic way. Are you aware of anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, the Canadians have some modest benefit, I would say, over the U.S. in terms of monitoring trends, because marijuana was legalized nationally for them, and so all their federal regulatory bodies are on board in a way that ours are not fully on board. So they are collecting some data. However, it's still a very new experiment that's happening, I don't know if I would have recommended for, if a Canadian policymaker asked me in 2015 what I thought they should do, I don't think I would say, jump in and take your entire population and see what happens. I think that the monitoring is the best you can do with a bad situation, and I think that in less than ideal situation, and they are monitoring things, but it's very early on, and some of the things that they found, to my knowledge, are not the most promising. It's not as though they found that there's zero consequences of these, of the actions that they took. But it's also very challenging, to be fair to researchers like myself. You have to be fair to both perspectives, even though public health people are lean towards incremental changes. It's still hard to figure out if those negative consequences were necessarily caused by marijuana, because they weren't really, these studies with observational trials, the way that they're done and the way that they're incentivized and the way that everything works, doesn't necessarily yield the highest quality research. So yes, I think that they're doing a better job, and it's the best that they can do, or close to it. But it's
observational studies of that type are really good at detecting large signals, but not so good for detecting weak signals.
Exactly. I think that that's very clear. I mean, I'll again take an analogy to tobacco. There were no RCTs that show that tobacco causes lung cancer, because that would be considered highly unethical, and no one would ever approve you to do that. However, the effect is so large, the effect is so clear and consistent, that it is, that it's unmistakable that this is that this is an effect. And also, I will say just one other thing that might be more of a pedantic point. The public health field in tobacco also acts, deferring to mitigate risks more so than maximize benefits. The harms are worse than the benefits. And so while we would require an RCT for any drug that we wanted to give out as a pharmaceutical drug, we don't require that for tobacco, because the observational research suggests that it's so bad that we don't want to take that risk with a larger, with a large randomized controlled trial. That's just the way that public health works. We minimize the harms. The Hippocratic Oath is do no harm. It's not make everyone live forever. It's do no harm. That's another component of it.
So on a final note, are there any details you can share about the research that you're currently working on related to marijuana?
Sure. I think that I've become quite interested in research as marketing. That idea that marijuana companies use weak or that they publicize or sponsor weak research in order to convey health claims to the public. I think that that's a very interesting area, and something that gets to the heart of why federal regulatory authority federal regulation is needed, because this is a deceptive and pernicious marketing technique that just wouldn't be picked up by state regulators who have who are not specially, they're not the FDA, they're not specially trained for this kind of stuff. I think that the part of what I'm working on now and looking into is always looking at how companies are using that research as marketing, and what related techniques they might be using, how they advertise or publicize their partnerships with with academic institutions or hospitals, and bringing some empirical evidence, which I think is more compelling, particularly to policymakers who ultimately have the final say here. But the truth is, we need people to act, and we need them to act soon. We need policymakers to understand the necessity of federal regulatory enforcement for these products and work out a solution such that that's possible. And I think that part of that is bringing evidence to bear that shows exactly how deceptive these companies are being now. How they're doing things that we wouldn't allow a pharmaceutical company or any medical or health company to do, without some kind of censor. And I think that bringing that evidence to bear is kind of the next step for all this.
Well, Theo, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. The work that you've done is absolutely amazing, and I really look forward to seeing more of your work and reading more of your research in the future.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on.
If you're interested in learning more about Theo's research, you can visit his website at theodorecaputi.com, where you'll find many of his peer-reviewed papers. And if you'd like to find out more about the great work Drug Free America Foundation is doing, or to support our work, please visit us at www.dfaf.org. Thanks again for listening to the Pathways to Prevention podcast.